Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Thursdays with Friends. I am the show's producer, Wesley Wolfer Pinkham. Thursdays with Friends is our online conversation on current issues. Today, I am producing the show from California, although you wouldn't know it by my background, right in front of the FCNL offices. Out here in California, we are back in a drought season. So that's after leaving DC, where we've had lots of rain and thunder. So this has been Wesley Wolfer Pinkham with the weather. Now we're going to throw it over to Diane Randall, our host for the show, and her guest, Marisa León-Gómez Sonet, Legislative Associate for FCNL's Immigration and Refugee Program.
Thank you very much, Wesley, and great to see you out there in California. It is a beautiful day here in Washington, D.C., and I'm really pleased to be joined by Marisa to discuss really a critical issue that so many people are tracking and that this country has had a very difficult time coming to terms with, in our Congress specifically. So Marisa is going to give us a little bit of background and also fill us in on some of the status of what's happening in Congress on this. As always, we have a legislative ask, and as always, we have a gratitude to express to you as people who are active with FCNL, both in being contributors to our work, as well as people who take action. And some of you do that with your meetings or churches or groups. Some of you do it as individuals. And we are very grateful for the full support that you give to FCNL. I do want to just take a moment and celebrate the great victory we had last week with the House vote to repeal the 2002 authorization for the use of military force. Yeah, we're pretty happy about that. There are a lot of people on this call who worked really hard on that. And it was a very, very big vote. And we are grateful for Representative Barbara Lee's consistent and long-term support of that. There was a little bit of a glitch in the Senate. There's a request by some Republicans to have a briefing, which will take place in July for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And we do expect there'll be a vote coming up in the Senate. And we have every expectation that it will pass the Senate and the president will sign it. But I certainly wouldn't want to predict exactly when that's going to happen. So as with all issues that we work on, our best hopes sometimes are always followed by very diligent work, or preceded, I should say, by very diligent work. And that is no different than this issue of immigration and refugees. So about 6 months ago, FCNL participated with 5 other Quaker organizations, really led by our friends at the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva, who put together a policy paper, a statement on migration and justice. It is something that Marisa had a hand in, and it summarized principles that have long guided immigration and refugee work. And I think we'll get it up in the chat, and I commend it to you if you haven't seen it as a reflective piece to take a look at. Our work on immigration is rooted in our Quaker belief that there is that of God in every person, and it is our spiritual leading to uphold the value of every single individual. We acknowledge that migration is an inherent part of human behavior, and we must protect and uphold the human rights of everyone who is a migrant. My guest this afternoon is Marisa León-Gómez Sonet. Prior to joining FCNL, she worked with the Chicago Religious Leadership Network on Latin America on issues regarding U.S. foreign policy to Latin America, human rights, immigration, and social justice. Marisa has also worked with the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, South Africa, the Trust for Americas, and an organization, which is an organization affiliated with the Organization of American States. She holds a master's degree in global affairs from the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. And she earned her bachelor's degree at Salve Regina University in Newport, Rhode Island. So Marisa, there's so much we could focus on today, but let's start talking about the situation at our southern border, because that is what is in the news. Tell us a little bit about what's happening there.
Yeah. And thank you, Diane, for the question. And thank you, everyone joining us today. I want to thank everyone that has, as Diane said, supported FCNL, whether it is through donations or participating in our advocacy and lobbying visits. I'll start with the border. We are seeing a lot of things and a lot of news about the situation at the border and the increase of unaccompanied minors coming to the border and just of migrants in general. I would just say, and I'll start by this, that the situation at the border is not unprecedented and it's not new. We saw this under President Obama in 2014 with an increase of unaccompanied minors. We certainly saw it under the Trump administration in 2018 and 2019 with the migrant caravans, and we're seeing it again with President Biden. And my response to this is threefold. First of all of the administrations I'd mentioned and previous administrations to those have spent a lot of money on militarization of the border, on funds for building the border wall, on deportation mechanisms, on building detention centers. And FCNL has been a big proponent and have done a lot of advocacy work through the appropriations component in Congress to limit the funds that go to problematic agencies such as ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and CBP, the Customs and Border Patrol. These agencies spend a lot of money in what I said, militarizing the border instead of looking for alternatives to detentions, for instance. So FCNL has worked hard on appropriations and decreasing and limiting the funds to those agencies. The second thing I'll say about it is that there's a lot in the media right now saying that, it's because we have an open border policy. And I would say that that's very far from the truth. In fact, we have the most closed, the borders are the most closed they've ever been at the moment. And that's because of a specific policy called Title 42, which is basically a public health policy that was first issued by the CDC, but then since then the CDC has said that's not necessary, but it has been upheld both by the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And basically the policy says that the US has closed its borders because of COVID-19 concerns. So at the moment, the US is not taking asylum seekers, it's expelling, because it's not even deportations, because there is no due process. It's expelling those who are coming to our southern border. A court and judge in November of 2020, and also believe in January of 2021, has said that Title 42 shouldn't apply to unaccompanied minors and some family units. So currently all accompanied minors and some family units are allowed into the country, but everyone else is being expelled. And then the third thing I want to say also about the situation of the border and the increase of migrants and unaccompanied children is regarding root causes. So we definitely do not have an open border policy, but what we do have is a lot of root causes that are continuing to worsen. And I'll speak specifically about Central America, but I want to be clear that a lot of the migrants and asylum seekers coming to the border are not only from Central America. We have Caribbean nations, people from African countries coming to our border, but I'll focus on Central America, and I think it can be extended to other countries as well. That first we had a political and economic crisis happening in those countries, and now we're seeing a public health crisis with the pandemic and extreme inequality in terms of access to health, vaccine, education, etc. And then also in Central America, we're seeing a climate change crisis. And last year we had 2 huge hurricanes happening in the region. And I know we're just entering hurricane season again. So those of us who are monitoring migration from Central America are concerned about what it's going to look like this year. So that's basically a summary, and I'll stop there because I can talk forever, Diane, but that's kind of my view of what's happening at the border right now.
Thank you, Marisa. I want to just highlight 2 things that you said and maybe draw out a little bit more about that. One is that, of course, FCNL's focus is on what Congress should do or could do. And a lot of times we spend time thinking about what Congress isn't doing, because this has been a highly politicized issue. It certainly was during the Trump administration. But there are policies that the Obama administration implemented that may have been certainly exacerbated and worsened. And certainly the rhetoric was, vilified under the Trump administration. And the Biden administration is still carrying some of those out, but also trying to do some things differently. And so can you talk about that question about sort of what we're seeing that is different over the last few years, specifically in relation to changes at the border, and how do you think that's influencing the impact on on our efforts to try to move forward on legislation? I mean, I'm kind of asking your opinion here as opposed to specifically what's going on, but you've been following this so closely. So I'm intrigued by it because it wasn't, it's clear that the election of a new president hasn't completely changed this at all. And so and even though there were executive orders, I just want to be clear, even though there were executive orders that Biden immediately reversed, for which we are very grateful, which have an impact on some people who are undocumented in the US, and yet there's still so much more we have to do.
Yeah, for sure. I think, like you mentioned, we did see a lot of important executive action happening right after the inauguration. Some of those were very important, such as repealing the travel bans that mainly affected African, Muslim, and refugees, people that were trying to come through the refugee resettlement program. We saw that the Biden administration increased the refugee resettlement numbers to 62,500, which had been decimated by the Trump administration to around 15,000, right? So that was huge, and that only happened because of the advocacy of, certain members of Congress, but also communities like ours who are pressing Congress and the administration to create a more humane refugee and immigration system. But as you said, Diane, we have not seen massive changes. The Biden administration, like I was talking about, has still kept Title 42, which is basically not letting anyone, even those who are looking for asylum, into our country. And also, we are seeing kind of the same problems, and we'll talk about it later, about Congress and looking for permanent solutions that would provide protection to undocumented communities in this country. I think we're facing some challenges in the Senate to pass the bills that we want to, but I think that for sure the situation hasn't changed too much. And we can talk as well about the recent trip of Vice President Kamala Harris to Guatemala and Mexico. I know that she'll be going to El Paso, Texas tomorrow to visit a portion of the border. But I'll just say that the Biden administration has been giving sort of mixed signals, which I think it's hard to do at the same time. You cannot be welcoming but excluding and at the same time. And I think we have some policies that have been very welcoming to migrants, and that have, we've seen the preservation of DACA and fortifying DACA. We have seen the refugee resettlement numbers. We have seen executive action that's really good. But at the same time, we have seen statements and policies like Title 42, which are not welcoming and which is keeping track to what the Trump administration was doing in the past years.
Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned the Vice President's recent trip and her upcoming trip to the southern border as steps that are being taken. When she was in Mexico and Guatemala, she basically encouraged people to not come. And I guess I'm just interested in knowing, do you see that when she takes these trips, are members of Congress with her, or is she going on her own? And also, what impact do you think that this will have? Do you think we'll begin to see some recommendations coming out of the White House based on these trips?
So Vice President Kamala Harris was in Mexico and Guatemala about 2 weeks ago. And like you mentioned, she said publicly, do not come. The U.S. is a country that will continue to enforce laws and deport people. And basically she said, if you come, you'll get deported back, which is true, which is the case with Title 42 right now. People are being expelled without due process. Like I mentioned, I don't think it's possible to be welcoming and excluding at the same time. Vice President Kamala Harris was by herself in that trip, so she wasn't accompanied by members of Congress. And I don't think she will tomorrow when she visits the border. The Biden administration had sent to Congress the United States Citizenship Act of 2021, which is a huge bill. It's a comprehensive bill that I don't foresee moving in the Congress right now, but basically it would provide pathway to citizenship to 11 million undocumented people. So we are seeing that the administration is trying to be active and send to Congress policies. But at the same time, I think Vice President Kamala Harris and representing the administration in her trip and in her remarks was not reflecting how the US should be a country that welcomes immigrants, that welcomes asylum seekers. On top of that, as you said at the beginning, migration is a human right. So those that need to flee their countries should have access to do so in a safe manner. And also the US is required by both federal and international law to accept asylums and to not deport anyone back to the place that they were fleeing from danger. So I think that the vice president's remarks were not reflective of this. And, I keep mentioning it's just conflicting messages of sending bills to Congress that would be very helpful for immigrants in the country, but at the same time saying, well, immigrants are not welcome. If you do come, you'll be expelled back. And they are keeping policies like Title 42 that are doing just that.
Well, we know, we talk all the time at FCNL about the impact of public pressure on Congress and constituent pressure on Congress. And certainly we have a legislative ask of people today to contact their members of Congress that I'm going to ask you to talk about in just a few minutes. But let's turn our attention now. We already had Art Evans ask us about DACA and what's going on with DACA. The fact is that I don't remember what the latest statistics are, but a huge majority of people in this country believe that the deferred action for childhood arrivals should be made law permanently, and that people should be allowed to stay here and have a pathway to citizenship. But yet we haven't seen that pass in Congress. So what's the status of that, and how does our work reflect what we'd like to see happen?
Yeah, so FCNL, we have been working a lot on lobbying and advocating for Dream and Promise, which is a bill that would provide pathway to citizenship to DACA. As you mentioned, DACA is deferred action for childhood arrivals. And those are people that came to the US, children that came to the US under the age of 18 and that basically know the US as their only home. So they came here very young. And as you mentioned, there is a lot of bipartisan support for them to have pathway to citizenship. Dream and Promise also would provide pathway to citizenship to TPS, temporary protected status, and DED, deferred enforced departure. Sorry, that's a lot of acronyms, but basically those two programs, TPS and DED, are programs that protect people from deportation and provide them with work authorizations and basically a legal status in the US because there is either natural disasters in their home countries or conflict, some wars or any other issues along those lines that wouldn't allow them to go back to those countries. These are great programs, DACA, TPS, and DD, and we're supportive of them. But the problem with them is that they are temporary. They're not permanent solutions, and they're constantly at risk in the courts. They're being challenged in the courts. I know that DACA is, and also TPS recently was up even in the Supreme Court. So they're temporary, and they're also at risk in the change in administration. We know that for a fact the Trump administration tried through various legal channels to end DACA. So we want Dream and Promise to pass because it will provide permanent solution, provide a pathway to citizenship for these groups of people. But even though there's bipartisan support, we are having problems securing the 60 votes needed in the Senate. And when we do find the support, we are finding that some lawmakers, perhaps the most moderate conservative ones, are looking to make dangerous compromises. So they would agree to pathway to citizenship, but in exchange, they would ask for more money to build the wall, more money for detention centers, more money for deportation mechanisms. And as we were talking about in the beginning, we don't want to see that. In fact, we want to limit the money for border wall, et cetera. So it's a problem about looking for those 60 votes in the regular train order of things. And also, what are the compromises to get to those 60 votes? We definitely do not want to compromise in anything that's dangerous or that would be bad for immigrants coming into the country. And I know that directly impacted communities have long said this. So it's a challenge there.
I'm glad you brought back again. I mean, FCN, as you mentioned at the beginning, some of our work on immigration has been in the appropriations process to try to limit the funding for militarizing the border and for deportations and detention. And I think that's really that doesn't always get into the headlines, but it is actually a really important step to try to prevent that funding. It certainly was a big priority in the last administration. And now this issue, like many other issues, is facing the demand that we need 60 votes and that we have opposition to getting to that. And it makes it really difficult to see movement, despite the fact of the widespread support, for example, for these programs that you identified. One of the political conversations that's happening right now that I think you've been involved with, and you've worked with some of the coalitions, and we do work with a number of coalitions that work on this issue, is the question of whether we could include a pathway to citizenship for the DACA, for the temporary protected status, and essential workers and farm workers in a recovery package that would go through a reconciliation process that would only require 51 votes. Can you give us a little bit of a status update on what's happening with that right now? We just had big news this afternoon. I noticed that there's agreement on an infrastructure package, but this would not be part of that. It would be part of, I assume, a future agreement.
Yes, for sure. So like I mentioned, we are having problems securing those 60 votes. And if we go through the recovery package and what would be passing it through reconciliation, which is just, as you mentioned, a budget tool that would allow us to pass those bills through 51 votes rather than 60. As of this week, we saw some news about the chairman, the Senate chairman, Bernie Sanders, on the budget committee. It was a leak, but his budget resolution did include funding for Pathway to Citizenship to be included in the recovery package. So this is great news. But we still face some challenges around it. First, because it is a budget tool, the parliamentarian must rule that including Pathway to Citizenship is allowed to do so in the recovery package. And then we also need to make sure that that we have all 51 votes that's needed to pass it through reconciliation. So even though we don't need the 60 votes, we need to make sure that the 51 votes are there. And that's why our advocacy is so important at the moment. We need to continue talking to members of Congress, both in the House and in the Senate, and asking for Pathway to Citizenship to be included in the recovery package. As you said, we're asking for more of an extension in terms of the groups that would be included there. So it's not only DACA and TPS, but it's also essential workers and farm workers. Through the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen the importance of essential workers. About 5 million undocumented essential workers were at the front lines of the pandemic. And we, of course, know the importance of the farm workers putting food in our tables as we go through all of this, and obviously even during normal times. So it's really important that their work is recognized, that their sacrifice is recognized, and that it is included in recovery legislation, and that hopefully we'll have the 51 votes to pass it through the reconciliation tool.
That's great. We're starting to get a couple of questions in the chat, and I want to go to those and encourage you to ask more. But I just want to ask you, Marisa, if you have anything you want to share about one of our programs that many people on this call know about is our Advocacy Corps, which is our young adult program where organizers, young adults are hired to work with FCNL as organizers and advocates in their local communities. And it's a program that runs kind of August through May. And we just completed a cohort of Advocacy Corps participants who focused on immigration and focused on Pathway to Citizenship. Can you say anything about like what impact that has when young people are organizing in their community and taking people into offices to talk about this? Because in some ways, we sometimes get like, flare-ups on this issue when there's something in the news, and sadly often a tragedy, but it is the kind of thing that's going to take persistent and constant advocacy. So I'm just wondering if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the work that grassroots communities and young people are doing on the ground is extremely important and absolutely crucial to get this legislation passed. As I said, even through reconciliation, which only requires 51 votes, we need to make sure that those 51 votes are there and that it's going to happen. So people like those that were participating in the Advocacy Corps and that were lobbying with members of the Advocacy Corps are extremely crucial. And, you know, offices want to hear from young people, want to hear from directly impacted communities, want to have the voices at the table. And if they don't want that, we also want to be there anyway, and making sure that our voices are heard and that our ask is being heard. So I think the Advocacy Corps and those that were lobbying with Advocacy Corps and other young people and grassroots organizers around the country are doing crucial work, and it's extremely important, extremely valuable. And I think that is basically the only way that we'll see those bills passed is through the advocacy and the support of grassroots communities and the work that we're doing, both on the Hill, but also in the ground in all states of the country.
Thanks. It's very powerful to hear their stories because they're often directly affected by this, and so it is really important. Okay, here's a question that I'm not sure whether you know the answer. This is certainly sort of a new area for me, but through on the YouTube channel, someone asked that they heard that if President Biden would threaten an order invalidating 20 years of deportations based on a Supreme Court decision, the Niz-Chavez decision, it could bring Republicans to the table to fix the immigration system, which could be an opportunity. We don't track a lot of we obviously pay attention to what's happening in the Supreme Court, but we're not obviously doing litigation. Is that anything you've heard about, Marisa, at all?
Sorry, I'm trying to find the question.
It was in the chat from Jim. It comes from Jim, and it was he just brought the chat up from Walker Grooms, just hearing about this Niz-Chavez decision. Again, it's not a decision that I've heard about. So maybe we can try to follow up with you and find out more information about that and be able to respond to it. I do want to pose a question that Wesley actually asked, and then this probably will be almost our last question, but it was a question about whether there is oversight, whether there's congressional oversight of private contractors who are running detention facilities at the border. What do you know about that?
Yeah, for sure. There is private contractors that are, looking to make money out of detaining immigrants and asylum seekers in detention centers. As I said, we have been working on decreasing and limiting the funding that goes to ICE and CBP, who are the agencies that oversee this and who are in charge of detention centers. So I think the appropriations is absolutely important topic to talk about. We participate through our Defund Hate Coalition on limiting ICE and CBP funding. And I think it's important that we continue doing advocacy, and also you can reach to your members of Congress and ask them for limit those fundings to problematic agencies and instead look for alternatives to detention. One that is not private and that is not, making money for private companies, and instead look for humane ways in which the U.S. can process and properly address people who are coming into the country and asking for asylum and other immigration components.
So we didn't really get to dive into the root causes issue. You did mention it earlier, and you mentioned climate change and the situation, for food, for people just to grow their own food in many of the Central American countries is one of the drivers. And we have seen that in other places around the world, that climate change is a driver. And there's some, tragic irony that, many farm workers who are in California who are undocumented are also facing, risks just by coming here to do this work. So I guess I'll just end with saying that, if you want to make any closing comments on that, I know it's a very broad topic, but just invite you to make some closing comments, Marisa, as we close out our half hour of Thursdays with Friends, either on the root causes or on anything else you might want to add before we end.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched upon the root causes as the last comment. I recently wrote an op-ed that's currently in our website about root causes and how U.S. foreign policy can exacerbate those root causes. The U.S., again, this is why appropriations and funding is so important, because the U.S. has provided lots of funding to countries in Central America, to governments in Central America that are known for their human rights abuses, to militaries that are acting against their own citizens, right? That's definitely the case in my own country of Honduras. So we want to do the same through U.S. foreign policy. Ask, where is our money going? Where is U.S. taxpayers' money going? Why are we funding governments that are known for their corruption, that they're known for their human rights abuses? And I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but I would just point people to my recently published op-ed in NACLA, which is a blog post for a lot of Latin American issues. And you can read more about it, and for sure know that, the U.S. has a role in root causes through foreign policy. And that is a way that we can engage Congress as well, and when talking about root causes.
Marisa, thank you so much. And thank you for pointing out that Marisa's done quite a bit of writing actually on the FCNL website on the issues. And so if you go to our website and look up, under issues immigration, you'll see a lot of what she's written. Here's Stephen's kindly put it in the chat for us as well. So you can see some of these, but I commend you to go back and look over the last few months, actually. It's been terrific to have Marisa working with us. She came to FCNL as a program assistant and is really leading this work for us right now. And we are so grateful for her leadership and her participation on behalf of FCNL, but also with coalitions within Washington, D.C. and really around the world with Quakers around the world on this Quaker migration statement. So Marisa, thank you for this afternoon, for your expertise and commentary this afternoon. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Always, we love having you with us, and we appreciate everything you do for FCNL. And we're looking forward to a good summer here. We see Congress is going to go out for a little while in recess, but they have a lot of work to do. And we're going to be talking to Amelia Keegan, who's the director of our domestic policy and the lead for economic justice, working in about a couple of weeks. And Amelia plays a very vital role in working with faith communities here on the American Families Plan. So please stay tuned for that, or come back and visit us for that. We think it's going to be a powerful conversation about work that we'll be really focused on for the rest of the summer and maybe for the rest of the year. So again, thank you, Marisa, and thank you everyone who joined us today. Take care.
Thank you, Diane. Bye.